branch under Lyra's foot cracked, and her whole body went still. Below her, in the clearing lit by a ring of torches, hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, and not one of them looked up. She let out the breath she had been holding, and pressed herself flatter against the trunk of the old oak. Her heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. If anyone found her here, in the sacred grove during the mating ritual, there would be no explanation good enough to save her. Outsiders did not watch this ceremony. Outsiders were not even supposed to know it existed. She had heard about it for years, in whispers, in warnings, in the kind of stories parents told their children to keep them away from the northern woods on the night of the full moon. Tonight, the Blackthorn Pack would choose the next Alpha Queen. Tonight, 5 women who had trained their whole lives for this one moment would stand before their king and hope that fate, and his instincts, chose them. Lyra had told herself she only wanted to see it once, just once, from a safe distance, hidden in the leaves where no wolf could reach her. She did not belong to any pack, she never had. As long as she could remember, it had been just her, moving from town to town to forest, never staying anywhere long enough to be noticed. She told herself, curiosity was harmless. She told herself, watching was not the same as belonging. But her hands were shaking on the bark, and every instinct in her body was screaming that she had made a terrible mistake. Below, the fire in the center of the clearing roared higher, sending sparks spiraling up toward the black sky. The 5 candidates stood in a straight line, dressed in pale ceremonial robes, their faces lit gold by the flames. Lyra recognized none of them, but she did not need to know their names to see how much this moment mattered to each of them. One woman's hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles had gone white. Another stood perfectly straight, chin lifted, refusing to let anyone see her fear. And then the crowd parted, and Lyra saw him. She had heard the name before, Cade, Alpha King of the Blackthorn Pack, but nothing she had heard prepared her for the sight of him walking into that firelight. He moved like the forest itself had made room for him, like the ground under his boots knew better than to slow him down. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed simply in dark clothing that did nothing to hide the coiled strength underneath. But it was not his size that made the hair rise on the back of Lyra's neck. It was the stillness in him. Even from this distance, even hidden in the leaves 50 feet above the ground, she could feel the weight of his presence pressing against the clearing like a held breath. The elders began to speak in low, ceremonial tones, words in a language Lyra did not fully understand, though she caught pieces. Bond, blood, chosen, forever. She leaned forward without meaning to, gripping the branch tighter, drawn in despite every warning bell going off in her mind. This was the moment, the ritual was about to begin, and that was when everything went wrong. Cade's head turned, not toward the candidates, not toward the fire. He turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the tree line, toward the exact spot where Lyra was hiding. For one terrible second, she thought he had heard the branch crack earlier. She thought her mistake had already caught up to her, but it was worse than that. She watched his nostrils flare, watched his shoulders go rigid, watched something shift in his expression that she could not name but recognized instantly as danger. He had caught a scent, her scent. The elders kept speaking, unaware that anything had changed, but Cade was no longer listening to them. His gold-brown eyes were fixed on the darkness above the clearing, scanning the branches, searching. Lyra's pulse roared in her ears. She knew, with sudden and complete certainty, that if she moved even an inch, he would find her. She did not move. She barely breathed. She watched him take one step away from the ceremonial circle, then another, his attention entirely consumed by whatever he had smelled on the wind. Beside him, an older wolf, clearly one of the pack elders, reached out and said something urgent, something that made 2 of the 5 candidates turn pale. Cade ignored him completely. Lyra's mind raced through every possible outcome. She could try to run, but there was no way she could outrun a wolf, especially not the Alpha King himself. She could stay perfectly still and hope the wind shifted, hope his attention moved elsewhere, hope this was some kind of misunderstanding that would pass. But some deep, old instinct inside her, one she had never fully trusted, but had never been wrong before, told her that hoping was not going to save her tonight. The torches crackled, the fire threw shifting shadows across the clearing, and Cade took another step toward the trees, his focus narrowing, closing in, like a man following a single thread through a maze he already knew by heart. Lyra thought of everything she had left behind to get here. The small rented room in the village 3 miles east, the modest savings she had scraped together working odd jobs, the promise she had made to herself that she would see this ritual and then disappear again, the way she always did. She thought about how foolish that promise looked now, dangling somewhere above a king who was hunting her scent like it was the only thing that existed in the world. She thought about running, she thought about staying, and in the end, her body made the decision before her mind could catch up, because the branch beneath her, already weakened by her earlier shift in weight, gave a second, louder crack, and this time, everyone heard it. The clearing fell silent. 5 pairs of eyes, then hundreds, turned up toward the trees. Lyra's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, frozen, useless. Cade did not look surprised. He did not look angry, not exactly. He looked like a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected, something that had rearranged the entire shape of his night in the space of a single heartbeat. "Come down," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the clearing, as if the wind itself had decided to obey him. Now. Lyra's hands trembled against the bark. Every survival instinct she had ever relied on told her to stay hidden, to wait, to find another way out. But there was no other way out. Not from a wolf who had already found her scent, already located her exact position, already stopped an ancient sacred ceremony in front of his entire pack because of her. She looked down at the sea of faces staring up at her, some furious, some frightened, some simply stunned, and understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that whatever happened next would change everything. Slowly, carefully, she began to climb down. The bark scraped against her palms as she lowered herself branch by branch, every movement watched in absolute silence by hundreds of wolves who had never expected an outsider to appear in the middle of their most sacred night. She could feel their eyes on her like heat from the fire, and she kept her own eyes fixed on the ground, refusing to look at any of them until her feet finally touched solid earth. When she straightened and lifted her head, Cade was standing only a few feet away. Up close, he was even more overwhelming than he had been from the treetop, the kind of presence that made the space around him feel smaller, more charged, harder to breathe in. His eyes, she now saw clearly, were a deep gold brown, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made it completely impossible to do so. "You should not be here," he said quietly. It was not quite an accusation. It sounded, strangely, like he was speaking more to himself than to her. "I know," Lyra managed. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I didn't mean any harm. I'll leave. Right now, if you let me." A murmur rippled through the crowd behind him. One of the elders, an older man with silver hair and sharp, assessing eyes, stepped forward. "Alpha," he said, his tone urgent, low. "The ritual. We must continue before the moon passes its peak, or the bonding window closes for another cycle." Cade did not turn to look at him. He did not seem to hear him at all. His attention remained locked entirely on Lyra, on her face, on the way the firelight caught in her eyes. And something in his expression had shifted from suspicion into something far more complicated, something that looked almost like disbelief. "Say that again," he said, still not looking away from her. "Alpha, the window. Not you." His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge underneath it now, something coiled and tense. "Her. Say something else." Lyra blinked, thrown off balance by the request. I said I didn't mean any harm." The moment the words left her mouth, she watched something ripple through him, subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tightened, his hands, which had been loosely open at his sides, curled slowly into fists, and his breath, for just a second, seemed to catch. The elder took another step forward, clearly alarmed now. "Alpha, what is it? What's happening?" Cade finally tore his eyes away from Lyra, and when he spoke, his voice had changed completely, quieter, rougher, stripped of the commanding tone he had used moments earlier. "Cancel the ritual," he said. The clearing erupted. Voices rose from every direction, shock, protest, confusion. The 5 candidates in their pale robes exchanging horrified glances, the elders converging toward Cade with a flurry of urgent questions, the crowd shifting and murmuring like a disturbed hive. Lyra stood frozen in the middle of it all, completely unsure what she had just caused, only certain that whatever it was, there was no way to undo it now. Alpha King Cade, the silver-haired elder said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. You cannot simply cancel a ritual that has been prepared for a full cycle of the moon. The pack expects. I know what the pack expects. Cade's voice was low but final, the kind of tone that ended arguments before they could properly begin. And I am telling you, Elder Corvin, that the ritual is not moving forward tonight. Corvin's eyes flicked toward Lyra, narrowing with open suspicion. Because of her. It was not a question, and Cade did not treat it like one. He said nothing, which somehow answered the question more clearly than words could have. Lyra felt the weight of dozens of stares settle on her again, heavier this time, edged with something closer to hostility. She understood, distantly, that she had just become the reason an entire pack's carefully planned night had collapsed, and packs, she suspected, did not forgive that kind of disruption easily. I should go, she said quickly, taking a small step backward. I never meant to interrupt anything. I'll leave right now, and none of this needs to. No. The word came out of Cade before she had even finished her sentence, sharp and immediate, and it silenced her completely. He was looking at her again, and this time there was no mistaking the intensity in his expression, something raw, urgent, almost desperate, buried beneath the composed authority he was clearly working hard to maintain. You're not leaving, he said, quieter now, but no less certain. Alpha, Corvin said again, his voice tight with disbelief. An outsider cannot remain within pack territory during a sacred ceremony. It is forbidden, if word spreads that you allowed. I am aware of what is forbidden and what is not, Elder. Cade's gaze did not move from Lyra's face. This is my decision, mine alone. One of the 5 candidates, a tall woman with dark hair and sharp cheekbones, stepped forward from the line, her expression a careful mask over what Lyra suspected was genuine fury. Alpha King, with respect, we have trained for this night for years. Some of us have waited our entire lives for the chance to stand in that circle. Are you truly saying all of that ends because of some stranger who climbed a tree to spy on us? The words landed like a slap, and Lyra felt her face heat with shame despite herself. She had not meant to hurt anyone. She had not thought, in her desperate curiosity, about the years of preparation these women had put into tonight, about what this ceremony meant to them beyond the mystery she had wanted to witness. Talia. Cade's voice carried a warning now, low and even. This is not the moment. Then when is the moment? Talia's composure cracked slightly, her voice rising. You have not even asked her name. You have not asked why she was here, hiding in the trees, watching a ceremony no outsider is permitted to see, and yet you would throw away everything the pack has prepared for, based on nothing more than a scent. The clearing went very quiet at that. Lyra felt every eye shift toward Cade, waiting, and she realized suddenly that whatever answer he gave next was not just about her. It was about power, about tradition, about a king choosing, in front of his entire pack, to defy the very ceremony meant to secure his future. Cade held Talia's gaze for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was iron underneath it. It is not nothing, he said. You know that as well as I do. Every wolf standing in this clearing knows what it means when an alpha's instincts respond the way mine just did. I did not choose this. None of us choose it. It chooses us. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd, whispers passing from wolf to wolf, faster than Lyra could track. She did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but she understood enough from the reaction around her to know that something significant, something the pack considered almost sacred, had just happened because of her. What is he talking about? She asked quietly, mostly to herself, though Cade heard her anyway. He turned to face her fully then, and for a moment, the noise of the clearing seemed to fall away entirely, as if it was only the two of them standing there in the firelight. There is an old bond, he said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her, though everyone nearby could still hear, rarer than anything this ritual could ever produce. Most wolves live their whole lives and never encounter it. Some don't believe it still exists at all. And you think I'm... Lyra stopped, unable to finish the thought, unsure she even believed what she was about to say. I don't think, Cade said. I know. Corvin made a sound of open disbelief, and several of the elders began speaking at once, their voices overlapping into a wall of protest and disbelief. Talia had gone pale, her earlier anger replaced by something closer to shock. The other 4 candidates stood frozen in their pale robes, watching the scene unfold, with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed devastation. Lyra felt suddenly, overwhelmingly out of place, a stranger who had climbed into the wrong tree on the wrong night and stumbled into the middle of something enormous, something with centuries of tradition and expectation behind it, something she had no framework to understand. I don't know what any of this means, she said, and her voice, for the first time since she had climbed down from the tree, cracked with genuine fear. I don't belong here. I don't belong to any pack. I was just curious. I never wanted to be part of whatever this is. Cade's expression softened, just slightly, the fierce authority in his eyes giving way to something gentler, though no less intense. I understand that this is not something you asked for, he said, but it has happened regardless, and I will not pretend otherwise, not to my pack, and not to you. Alpha King, Corvin's voice was sharp again, cutting through the moment. This is not a decision you can make alone. The council must be convened. The elders must weigh in. You cannot simply abandon a ritual centuries in the making because of a single scent, however strong the pull may feel tonight. Cade turned to face him, and for the first time, Lyra saw a flash of something dangerous cross his expression, not directed at her, but at the elder standing before him. I have led this pack for 6 years, Cade said, his voice low and even, but carrying an unmistakable edge. I have followed every tradition asked of me. I have made every sacrifice this position required, but I will not deny what my own body has just told me, not for ceremony, not for politics, and not for anyone's comfort, including my own. The clearing held its breath. Convene the council if you must, Cade continued. But nothing that happens in that meeting will change what has already happened here tonight. He turned back to Lyra, and despite the chaos still simmering around them, his expression when he looked at her was almost calm, almost gentle, in a way that seemed entirely at odds with the storm he had just caused. What is your name? He asked quietly. She hesitated only a moment before answering. Lyra. Lyra. He said it slowly, like he was testing the shape of it, like it mattered more than any word he had spoken all night. You are not in danger here. Whatever happens next, I promise you that. Behind him, Corvin was already turning to gather the other elders, his face tight with barely restrained frustration. Talia had stepped back into the line of candidates, her expression unreadable, though her eyes kept flicking toward Lyra with something sharp and calculating beneath the surface. The fire continued to crackle in the center of the clearing, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted across the grass, and somewhere beyond the torches, the full moon hung heavy and silver in the sky, indifferent to the chaos it had somehow set into motion. Lyra looked at Cade, at the king who had just upended his own sacred ceremony in front of his entire pack because of a stranger hiding in a tree, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the life she had built around staying hidden, staying unnoticed, staying safe, by never being seen, that life had just ended, whether she was ready or not. What happens now? She asked. Cade's eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, even as the pack around them buzzed with disbelief, and the elders whispered urgently among themselves. Now, he said quietly, we find out exactly why the wind carried your scent to me tonight, of all nights, and why, the moment it did, nothing in this world felt more important than stopping everything to find you. Somewhere in the crowd, Corvin was already calling for the council to gather before dawn. Somewhere behind Talia's carefully composed face, something bitter and dangerous was beginning to take root, and somewhere above the clearing, the moon continued its slow climb across the sky, indifferent to kings, rituals, or the fragile, uncertain thread that had just been pulled taut between a king and a woman who, until tonight, had never belonged anywhere at all. Lyra did not know it yet, but the life she thought she understood, the quiet, hidden, unremarkable life she had built for herself out of necessity, was already gone. And what waited for her now, in the tangled world of packs and bloodlines and ancient bonds she barely understood, would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. The council would meet before sunrise. The rival candidates would not accept defeat quietly. And somewhere in her own forgotten past, buried under years of running and hiding, an answer was waiting. One that would explain not just why Cade's instincts had reacted the way they had, but why Lyra had never truly belonged to the ordinary world she had spent her whole life trying to disappear into. For now, though, she simply stood in the firelight, the king's eyes still fixed on her, as if she were the only steady point in a world that had just tilted sideways, and understood only one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back to the life she had known before tonight. The council chamber sat carved into the side of a hill on the far edge of Blackthorn territory, its stone walls smoothed by centuries of hands and weather, its single great room lit by torches that never seemed to go out. Lyra had never seen anything like it. She stood just inside the entrance, flanked on either side by two silent guards who had escorted her there the moment the elders finished their heated exchange in the clearing, and tried not to let her nerves show on her face. Cade stood a few feet away, arms crossed, jaw tight, clearly still fighting a battle of his own, not with her, she realized, but with the 8 elders now seated in a semicircle before them, each one regarding her with an expression somewhere between suspicion and open disapproval. Corvin sat at the center of the group, his silver hair catching the torchlight, his hands folded neatly in his lap in a way that somehow made him look even more intimidating than if he had been shouting. "Let us be clear about what occurred tonight," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stone chamber. "An outsider trespassed on sacred ground during the most important ceremony this pack performs once every generation. The Alpha King, upon detecting her presence, abandoned that ceremony entirely. A ceremony that 5 candidates spent years preparing for. A ceremony that determines the future leadership of this entire pack." "I did not abandon anything without reason," Cade said evenly. "You know precisely what reason." "I know what you claim," Corvin replied. "A mate bond is not something to be claimed lightly, Alpha. It has been generations since the last confirmed instance within our pack. Forgive me for wanting more than a single night's instinct before I accept that our future has been decided by a stranger's scent." Lyra felt her face flush, humiliation and confusion tangling together in her chest. She had no idea what a mate bond truly meant, beyond the fragments Cade had explained in the clearing, no framework for understanding why an entire council of powerful wolves was now arguing about her, as though she were a puzzle to be solved, rather than a person standing in front of them. "May I ask a question?" she said quietly, and the chamber fell silent, every elder turning to look at her, with varying degrees of surprise that she had spoken at all. Corvin's eyebrows rose slightly. "You may." "What exactly is a mate bond?" Lyra asked. "I've heard the word tonight more times than I can count, and no one has actually explained it to me." A long silence followed, elders exchanging glances, until finally, an older woman near the end of the row spoke, her voice softer than Corvin's, though no less serious. "It is the oldest bond our kind knows," she said. "Rarer than blood, rarer than rank. When a wolf finds their true mate, the connection announces itself through scent, unmistakable and undeniable, strong enough to override instinct, tradition, even duty. It is not something that can be manufactured through ceremony, no matter how carefully planned. It simply is, or it is not." "And you believe that's what happened tonight," Lyra said slowly. "Between him and me." "I do not believe anything yet," the woman replied carefully. "I am explaining what the Alpha King believes, and why his reaction tonight was so extreme that it stopped a ceremony centuries in the making." Lyra turned to look at Cade, searching his face for something. Reassurance, doubt, anything that might help her understand how a single scent could carry such enormous weight. He met her gaze steadily, and though his expression remained composed, she thought she saw something almost vulnerable flicker behind his eyes. "I did not choose this," he said quietly, echoing what he had told her in the clearing. "But I will not deny it either." Corvin leaned forward, his sharp eyes moving between the two of them. "Even if the bond is genuine, and I stress, that has not yet been confirmed, there remain serious concerns. This woman has no known pack affiliation, no recorded lineage, no history within our territory, or any neighboring one, that our trackers have been able to identify. For all we know, she could be a threat sent by a rival pack, or worse, entirely unaffiliated and unpredictable, in ways that could endanger the stability you have worked 6 years to build. I am not a threat to anyone, Lyra said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I came here because I was curious about a ceremony I'd heard rumors about my whole life. That's it. I didn't ask for any of this to happen, and frankly, I don't fully understand what this even is." "That may be true," Corvin said, not unkindly, though his tone remained firm. "But intention does not erase consequence. The pack requires stability, especially now, with tensions rising along our northern border with the Ashwood pack. An unknown variable, however unintentional, is not something we can simply overlook." Cade's jaw tightened at the mention of Ashwood, and Lyra noticed several of the elders shift uncomfortably at the name, though no one elaborated further. She filed the detail away, sensing it mattered more than anyone in the room was willing to say aloud in front of her. "What do you propose then?" Cade asked, his voice controlled but edged with impatience. "That I ignore what my own body has confirmed beyond any doubt, simply because her history is unknown to us?" "I propose caution," Corvin said. "A period of observation, time to determine whether this bond is genuine, and if so, to learn more about who this woman actually is, before any formal claim is made before the pack." Lyra felt a flicker of relief at the suggestion, some small hope that this entire overwhelming situation might slow down enough for her to find solid ground again. But Cade's expression remained tense, unconvinced. "And in the meantime," he said, "what becomes of the candidates who prepared for tonight's ritual? What becomes of Talia and the others who have given years of their lives toward a ceremony that may now never take place?" "That," Corvin said grimly, "is a question I suspect will cause far more trouble than the stranger currently standing in this chamber." As if summoned by the words, the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room swung open, and Talia strode in, still dressed in her pale ceremonial robes, her dark hair loosened from its earlier style, her expression a controlled storm of fury and humiliation. "Forgive the interruption," she said, though her tone made clear she felt no need for forgiveness at all. "But I believe I have a right to be present for this discussion, given that it directly concerns the future I have spent the last 4 years training for." Corvin sighed, clearly weary, but unwilling to deny her. "Talia, this is a private council session. With respect, Elder, nothing about tonight has been private. Half the pack witnessed the Alpha King abandon a sacred ritual in the middle of the ceremony. Whispers are already spreading through every corner of our territory. I would rather hear the council's decision directly than through rumor." Cade's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not order her removed, and Lyra suspected that spoke to something about the respect, or perhaps the political weight, Talia carried within the pack. "The council has not yet reached a decision," Corvin said. "We are still discussing the matter." Talia's gaze shifted to Lyra, sharp and assessing, sweeping over her with an intensity that made Lyra want to shrink back despite herself. "And what exactly is there to discuss? Either the bond is real, in which case the ritual is void, and I have wasted 4 years of my life, or it is not, in which case I would like to know why the Alpha King humiliated me and 4 other candidates in front of the entire pack for nothing." "No one is denying the impact this has had on you," Cade said, his voice softer than it had been with Corvin, though still firm. "I understand what tonight cost you. I do not take that lightly." "Don't you?" Talia's composure cracked, just slightly, her voice rising. "Because from where I stood, you crossed the entire clearing, without a second glance in our direction, chasing a scent from a woman none of us had ever seen before. That does not feel like something you take lightly, Alpha. That feels like something you had already decided, before any of us had a chance to prove ourselves." The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence. Lyra glanced between Talia's barely restrained anger and Cade's carefully guarded expression, and felt, uncomfortably, like she was standing at the center of a conflict that had been building long before she ever climbed into that tree, one rooted in years of expectation, ambition, and tradition that her sudden, accidental appearance had detonated in a single night. "I did not choose this outcome," Cade said finally, his voice quiet but unwavering. "None of us did. But I will not lie to you, Talia, or to this council, about what I felt tonight. It was not something I could ignore, no matter how carefully this ceremony had been planned." Talia held his gaze for a long moment, and Lyra watched something shift behind her eyes, the fury still present, but now layered with something colder, more calculating, more dangerous than open anger. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its heat entirely, replaced by a controlled, deliberate calm that somehow felt far more unsettling. "Very well," she said. "If the council determines this bond is genuine, I will accept it, as tradition requires. But I would ask the council to consider something else entirely." She turned toward Corvin, her expression composed once more. This woman appeared from nowhere, with no known lineage, no pack history, no explanation for where she has spent the last however many years of her life. Before this pack accepts her as anything more than a stranger who happened to smell a certain way on a particular night, should we not know exactly who she is, and where she truly comes from? Corvin nodded slowly, clearly finding merit in the suggestion despite the obvious tension underlying it. A reasonable request. Cade's eyes flicked toward Lyra, and she saw, beneath his composed exterior, a flash of something like worry. Not distrust of her, she realized, but concern for what such an investigation might uncover, or perhaps concern that there might be nothing to uncover at all. No answers, no explanation, just the mystery of a life lived entirely off the map. "I don't know much about where I come from," Lyra admitted quietly, and every eye in the chamber turned toward her once more. "I was raised by my mother, and she never spoke about our family, our history, or why we moved so often. She died when I was 17. Whatever she knew, she took with her." The admission settled heavily over the room. Talia's expression flickered with something Lyra couldn't quite read. Not sympathy exactly, but perhaps a recalculation of some kind, as if this new information had shifted the shape of whatever plan she had already begun forming. "Then we have our answer," Corvin said finally, his tone resigned but decisive. "The council will grant a period of observation. 30 days. During this time, the Alpha King's claim will remain unofficial, and this woman will remain under pack protection, while we determine, through whatever means necessary, exactly who she is, and where she comes from. If the bond is confirmed genuine at the end of this period, the matter will be settled according to tradition. If not, it will be," Cade interrupted quietly, though there was no arguing with the certainty in his voice. Corvin studied him for a long moment before nodding, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "We shall see, Alpha." As the council began to rise, the meeting apparently concluded for the night. Lyra felt the full weight of exhaustion finally catch up to her, the adrenaline that had carried her through the last several hours, draining away, and leaving something hollow and shaky in its place. She had climbed into a tree hoping to witness something forbidden and fascinating from a safe distance, and instead, had walked straight into the center of a conflict that now involved an entire pack's future, a furious rival candidate, and a bond she barely understood, but that had already reshaped the course of her life in the span of a single night. Cade stepped closer to her as the elders filed out, his expression softening now that the formal proceedings had ended. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Lyra admitted. "This is a lot to take in." "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry that it happened this way, in front of everyone, with no time to prepare you for any of it." She looked up at him, studying his face in the flickering torchlight, searching for some sign of the composed, commanding king who had stopped an entire ceremony with a single word, and finding instead someone who seemed, in this quiet moment, almost as uncertain as she felt. "Why did it happen this way?" she asked. "You could have waited. You could have let the ritual finish, and found me afterward, quietly, without all of this." Cade was silent for a long moment before answering. "Because the moment I caught your scent, nothing else in that clearing mattered to me anymore. Not the ritual, not the candidates, not even the council's approval. I know that must sound strange to you. It sounds strange to me, and I have known my entire life what this bond meant, what it could feel like if it ever happened. Knowing it and experiencing it are not the same thing at all." Lyra did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and for a moment, they simply stood there in the emptying chamber, the torches casting long shadows across the stone floor, the weight of everything that had happened settling slowly between them, like a fog, neither of them fully understood yet. Outside, beyond the thick stone walls, the moon continued its slow descent toward morning, and somewhere in the darkened corridors of the pack's territory, Talia walked alone, her earlier composure cracking further with every step, her mind already turning over possibilities, alliances, and plans that no council decision would be able to stop once they were set fully into motion. 30 days, Lyra thought, staring at the closed doors where the elders had departed. 30 days to prove she belonged somewhere she had never expected to find herself, in a world she barely understood, standing beside a king whose instincts had upended his entire pack in a single night, and 30 days, she suspected, would not be nearly enough time to prepare for whatever came next. Morning arrived heavy and gray, the kind of light that made everything look sharper and more real than it had the night before. Lyra woke in a small stone room within the pack's main lodge, disoriented for several seconds, before the events of the previous night came rushing back all at once. She sat up slowly, running a hand through her tangled hair, and tried to steady the uneasy churn in her stomach. A soft knock sounded at the door before she could gather her thoughts further. "Come in," she called, and a young woman entered, carrying a folded set of simple clothing, and a tray with bread, fruit, and a steaming cup of something that smelled faintly of herbs. "Good morning," the woman said, setting the tray down carefully. "I'm Mira. The Alpha King asked me to look after you while you're staying with us." Lyra studied her for a moment. Friendly face, warm brown eyes, an easy smile that seemed genuine, rather than politely obligatory. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it. I imagine most of the pack isn't exactly thrilled to have me here." Mira's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "It's been a strange night for everyone, but you shouldn't worry too much about what people are saying. Word travels fast, but so does understanding, once people have time to think things through." "What are people saying?" Lyra asked, unable to resist the question despite suspecting she wouldn't like the answer. Mira hesitated. "Mostly confusion. Some excitement, honestly. A confirmed mate bond hasn't happened in this pack for generations, and there are those who see it as something almost miraculous. But there's also concern. Talia has significant support among the older families, and there are people who feel she was treated unfairly last night." Lyra nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And what about you? What do you think?" Mira considered the question seriously before answering. "I think the Alpha King has never once acted rashly in the 6 years I've known him leading this pack. If his instincts responded the way they did last night, I don't think it was nothing. But I also think you deserve time to figure out what all of this means for you, without everyone deciding it for you first." It was, Lyra thought, the kindest thing anyone had said to her since she'd climbed down from that tree, and she found herself grateful for it in a way that surprised her. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra said. "What exactly happens during these 30 days? What am I supposed to do?" "Mostly you'll be settling in," Mira explained, "learning about the pack, about our customs, our history. The elders will likely want to speak with you further about your background, and the Alpha King," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "will likely want to spend time with you as well, to see if the bond deepens naturally, the way these things are meant to." "And if it doesn't?" Lyra asked. "If this all turns out to be some kind of mistake?" Mira's expression grew thoughtful. "Then you would be free to go, I imagine, though I don't think anyone truly expects that outcome. Mate bonds like this are exceedingly rare, precisely because they don't happen without reason." After Mira left her to eat and dress, Lyra sat alone in the quiet stone room, picking at the food without much appetite, her mind circling endlessly around everything that had happened. She thought about her mother, about the years of moving from place to place without explanation, about the questions she had asked as a child that were always met with careful deflection rather than honest answers. She had always assumed her mother's secrecy came from some kind of trouble, debt, or a past she wanted to escape. Now, sitting in a stone room within a wolf pack's territory, she wondered, for the first time, if the truth might have been something else entirely. A knock interrupted her thoughts again, sharper this time, and when she opened the door, she found Cade standing in the hallway, dressed more casually than he had been the night before, though he still carried himself with the same unmistakable authority. "I wanted to check on you," he said, "and to see if you'd be willing to walk with me. There are things I think you should see, about the pack, about our territory. It might help make sense of some of this." Lyra studied him for a moment, weighing the strange comfort she felt in his presence against the lingering unease of everything she still didn't understand. "All right," she said finally. "I'll come." They walked together through the pack's territory, as the morning sun burned off the last of the gray clouds, and Cade pointed out landmarks as they went. The training grounds where young wolves learned to control their shifts, the healing lodge where the pack's medics tended to injuries and illness, the longhouse where elders gathered to discuss matters of governance. Lyra listened, absorbing everything, gradually feeling some of the overwhelming tension from the previous night ease into something more manageable, though far from comfortable. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually, as they walked along a quiet path bordered by tall pines. "Last night, in the council chamber, someone mentioned tension with a pack called Ashwood. What was that about?" Cade's expression tightened slightly, and for a moment, Lyra thought he might deflect the question the way her mother always had. But he answered honestly, his voice measured. "Ashwood is a neighboring pack, larger than ours, led by an alpha who has made no secret of his ambition to expand his territory. There have been disputes over borderland for the last 2 years. Nothing that's escalated to open conflict yet, but tensions are rising. The ritual last night wasn't just about choosing a mate. It was also meant to solidify alliances, demonstrate strength, reassure the pack that our future was secure. And I disrupted all of that," Lyra said quietly. "You didn't disrupt anything," Cade said firmly. "What happened last night wasn't your fault. If anything, it revealed something the pack needed to know regardless of the political timing." Lyra wasn't entirely convinced, but she let the subject drop, sensing that pushing further would only deepen the guilt already settling uncomfortably in her chest. They continued walking in silence for a while, the forest around them quiet, except for bird song, and the soft crunch of their footsteps on the path. "Can I ask you something now?" Cade said eventually, glancing at her sideways. "Of course. What was it like, growing up the way you did, moving so often, never staying anywhere long?" Lyra considered the question carefully before answering. "Lonely, mostly. I never had the chance to make real friends, not the kind who stick around long enough to matter. I used to ask my mother why we couldn't just settle somewhere, and she'd always say it wasn't safe, without ever explaining what exactly we were unsafe from. Did she ever mention anything about wolves, packs, anything that might connect to what happened last night?" "No," Lyra said, shaking her head. "Never. If she knew anything about this world, she never told me. I didn't even know packs like this existed until I started hearing rumors a few years ago, and even then, I thought they were just stories." Cade was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "It's possible she was protecting you from something," he said finally. "There are stories, old ones, about bloodlines that were hidden deliberately, families who chose to disappear into the human world rather than risk certain complications that came with being known." "What kind of complications?" "I'm not certain," Cade admitted. "It's mostly legend at this point, stories passed down through generations, more myth than confirmed history. But if there's any truth to them, it might explain some of what happened last night, and why your scent carried the particular strength it did." Lyra absorbed this in silence, turning the possibility over in her mind. The idea that her mother's endless secrecy, her refusal to ever put down roots, might have been rooted in something as strange and enormous as this, felt both impossible and, somehow, exactly right, filling in gaps in a puzzle she had spent her entire life trying to piece together, without the right information. "I want to find out," she said finally. "Whatever the truth is, I want to know it." Cade nodded, something like respect flickering across his expression. "Then we'll find out together." They continued their walk as the sun climbed higher, and for the first time since the previous night's chaos, Lyra allowed herself a small measure of hope that the answers waiting for her, however strange or complicated, might finally explain the life she had spent so long trying to understand, and that whatever waited ahead, she would not have to face it entirely alone. But even as that fragile hope settled into place, elsewhere within the pack's territory, Talia sat alone in her private quarters, a map of the northern border spread across her table, her expression cold and calculating, as she traced the boundary line between Blackthorn and Ashwood territory with one careful finger. She had spent 4 years preparing to become Alpha Queen, 4 years of sacrifice and discipline that had evaporated in a single night because of a stranger who did not even know the true weight of what she carried. If the council would not act decisively to protect the pack's future, Talia thought, then perhaps it was time someone else did. She reached for a folded letter sitting at the edge of her table, one she had drafted and redrafted several times over the course of the morning, and read over the words one final time before deciding, at last, that it was ready to send. The council had granted 30 days. Talia intended to make certain that by the time those 30 days ended, there would be nothing left for Cade to claim. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Lyra spent her mornings with Mira, learning the customs and unspoken rules of pack life, and her afternoons with Cade, walking the territory, talking, slowly building something that felt less like obligation and more like genuine connection with each passing day. She found herself looking forward to those afternoons more than she wanted to admit, drawn to the quiet, steady way he listened when she spoke, the careful thoughtfulness behind everything he said. But beneath the surface of this fragile new normal, tension continued to build. Elders watched her with cautious, assessing eyes whenever she passed through the lodge. Pack members she had never met whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. And Talia, though outwardly composed whenever their paths crossed, carried herself with a coldness that made Lyra's skin prickle with unease every time they were in the same room. On the 7th evening, everything shifted again. Lyra was walking back from the healing lodge, where Mira had taken her to learn about the herbs the pack cultivated for treating injuries, when she noticed a group of wolves gathered near the northern edge of the territory, their voices low and urgent. She slowed, curious despite herself, and caught fragments of the conversation carried on the evening breeze. Tracks near the border, definitely Ashwood scouts. Third time this week, they're getting bolder. If the Alpha's distracted by all this mate bond business, who's watching the border properly? Lyra's stomach twisted at the words. Guilt she had been trying to manage all week, flaring sharply back to life. She continued walking, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, but the conversation stayed with her long after she was out of earshot. That night, she found Cade in the small study adjoining his private quarters, bent over a map similar to the one Talia had studied days earlier, his expression tense with concentration. "I heard some of the pack talking," Lyra said from the doorway, "about Ashwood scouts near the border." Cade looked up, surprise briefly crossing his face before settling into something more guarded. "You weren't meant to hear that." "Maybe not, but I did. Is it true? Are they testing the border because of what happened at the ritual?" He hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than any answer could have. "It's difficult to say with certainty. Ashwood has been probing our borders for months, long before the ritual took place. But I won't pretend the timing hasn't raised concerns among my advisors." "Because they think you're distracted," Lyra said quietly. "Because of me." "Because they don't yet understand what happened," Cade corrected, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Once the 30 days conclude and the bond is confirmed, much of this uncertainty will resolve itself." "And if it isn't confirmed?" Lyra asked, giving voice to the fear that had been building in her chest for days. "What happens to your pack then? What happens to the border, to Ashwood, to everything you've built, if this all turns out to be some kind of mistake?" Cade set down the marker he'd been using to trace the border and crossed the room to stand before her, his expression softer now, though no less serious. "It will not be a mistake," he said. "I have known that with certainty, since the moment your scent reached me in that clearing. Whatever uncertainty remains, it does not live in me." Lyra studied his face, searching for any trace of doubt, and finding none. "How can you be so sure?" "Because," he said quietly, "everything before that night feels distant now, like a life I was simply going through the motions of living, and everything since has felt more real, more present, than anything I can remember experiencing before. That is not something ceremony or tradition manufactures. That is something else entirely." The words settled over her, warm and unsettling all at once, and Lyra found herself, despite every instinct urging caution, believing him completely. "I want to help," she said suddenly, "with the border, with Ashwood, with whatever is happening. I don't want to be the reason your pack is vulnerable." Cade's expression shifted into something gentler, almost amused despite the seriousness of the conversation. "You don't need to prove anything to me, Lyra. Maybe not to you," she said. "But to the rest of the pack, I think I do." He considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "There's a meeting tomorrow, with the Border Patrol leaders. You could join, if you'd like. It might help you understand more of what we're facing, and it might help them understand more about you." Lyra agreed, and the following morning found her seated at the edge of a long wooden table, listening as gruff, weathered patrol leaders described increasingly frequent sightings of Ashwood scouts along the northern boundary. She said little, mostly observing, but she noticed the way several of the leaders glanced at her throughout the meeting, their expressions gradually shifting from wary suspicion to something more neutral as the morning wore on. It was a small thing, she knew. This single meeting. This single morning of proving she was willing to engage with the pack's problems rather than remain a passive cause of them. But it felt, to her, like the first real step toward earning a place here that had nothing to do with scent or bonds or ancient legends, and everything to do with simply showing up and trying. She did not yet know that across the territory, in a quiet clearing far from the lodge, Talia was meeting with a small group of trusted allies, finalizing plans that would soon make even this fragile, hard-won progress feel like nothing at all. The council granted 30 days, Talia said, her voice low and controlled, as she addressed the 3 wolves gathered around her. We do not have to wait that long to act. If we can prove, decisively, that this woman poses a genuine threat to the pack's stability, the council will have no choice but to reconsider its decision, regardless of what the Alpha King wants. And if there's nothing to find, one of her allies asked cautiously, if she truly is exactly what she claims to be. Talia's expression hardened. Then we will simply have to make certain that something is found. The days continued to pass, each one bringing Lyra closer to Cade, and, unknown to her, closer to a confrontation that would test every fragile piece of trust she had begun building within the pack. The northern border remained tense, Ashwood's scouts growing bolder with each passing week, and somewhere within Blackthorn's own territory, a rival's careful scheme moved steadily forward, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. 2 weeks into the 30-day observation period, the tension that had been quietly building beneath the surface of pack life finally broke into the open. It began with whispers, the way most dangerous things do. Lyra first noticed the shift in atmosphere during breakfast, when 2 pack members fell silent the moment she entered the dining hall, their expressions carefully blank in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. She caught Mira glancing at her with obvious concern throughout the meal, though her friend said nothing until they were alone afterward, walking toward the healing lodge for the day's lessons. There's something you should know, Mira said quietly, once they were far enough from other ears. Rumors are spreading. About your past. Lyra's stomach dropped. What kind of rumors? Mira hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. That you're not simply an unaffiliated wolf who happened to wander into pack territory. That you might have connections to Ashwood. That your appearance at the ritual wasn't an accident at all, but something arranged, meant to destabilize the pack from within. That's not true, Lyra said immediately, fear and anger tangling together in her chest. I've never had any contact with Ashwood. I didn't even know packs like this existed until a few years ago. I believe you, Mira said gently, but belief and proof are different things, and right now, there are people within this pack who would very much like proof of the opposite. Lyra felt sick, the fragile sense of belonging she had been slowly building over the past 2 weeks, suddenly feeling as thin and precarious as ice on a warming pond. Where are these rumors coming from? Mira's expression grew careful. I don't know for certain, but I have my suspicions. She didn't need to say the name aloud. Lyra already knew. That afternoon, Lyra sought out Cade, finding him in the middle of a tense meeting with several of his senior advisors. Discussion clearly focused on the same rumors that had reached her at breakfast. The room fell silent when she entered, and the expressions on several faces confirmed everything Mira had warned her about. You've heard then, Cade said quietly, once the room had cleared and they were alone. That I might be some kind of spy for Ashwood? Yes, I've heard. Lyra's voice shook slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. Do you believe it? No, Cade said immediately, without a moment's hesitation. Not for a second. But others do. Some do, he admitted. Fear makes people susceptible to suspicion, especially when there's already tension with a neighboring pack, and especially when that suspicion offers a convenient explanation for events people don't fully understand. What can I do? Lyra asked, desperation creeping into her voice. How do I prove something like this isn't true, when I don't even know exactly where these rumors are coming from? Cade was quiet for a long moment, his expression troubled. There may be a way, he said finally. A tracking ritual, one our trackers use to trace a wolf's origins through scent and blood memory. It's rarely used, and not without some discomfort, but it could provide concrete evidence of where you truly come from, evidence that would be difficult for anyone to dispute. Lyra considered this, weighing the discomfort of an unfamiliar ritual against the alternative of living under a cloud of suspicion that could, if left unaddressed, unravel everything she had begun building here. "I'll do it," she said. "Whatever it takes to prove I'm not what they're saying I am." The ritual took place 2 days later, in a small chamber, deep within the healing lodge, overseen by an elderly tracker, named Silas, whose weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared the herbs and materials needed for the process. Cade remained close throughout, his presence a steady, grounding comfort, as Silas explained what would happen. "This will draw on the deepest layers of scent memory within your blood," Silas said, his voice calm and measured. "It can reveal traces of ancestry, of places significant to your bloodline, sometimes even fragments of memory passed down through generations. It may be disorienting. Try to remain still, and let the process unfold naturally." Lyra nodded, steeling herself, and Silas began. The ritual was unlike anything she had experienced before, a strange, dizzying sensation that felt like falling backward through layers of time, fragments of scent, and half-formed images flickering at the edges of her awareness. She caught glimpses of forests she didn't recognize, a woman's voice singing softly, in a language she couldn't place, the distant impression of mountains rising against a gray sky. And then, abruptly, something sharper, clearer than the rest, a large stone structure, ancient and imposing, carved with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with recognition, even through the haze of the ritual. A crest, she realized, a family crest, though she had never seen it before in her life. The ritual ended as suddenly as it began, and Lyra found herself gasping, disoriented, Cade steadying hands on her shoulders, as Silas studied her with an expression of dawning astonishment. "What did you see?" Cade asked urgently. "A stone structure," Lyra managed, still catching her breath. "Old, with a crest carved into it. I don't know what it means." Silas's weathered face had gone pale, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like disbelief. "Describe the crest," he said quietly. "Precisely, if you can." Lyra closed her eyes, calling the image back to mind. 2 wolves, facing each other, with a mountain rising between them, and underneath, some kind of symbol I didn't recognize, like a broken circle. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Lyra opened her eyes again, alarmed by the expression on Silas's face. "That crest," Silas said slowly, "belonged to the Duskwood bloodline, a pack that was believed to have been entirely wiped out nearly 30 years ago, during a conflict so devastating it nearly reshaped the balance of power across the entire region." Cade's grip on Lyra's shoulders tightened slightly. "Wiped out how?" "Betrayal," Silas said grimly. "From within, according to the old accounts. Details were never fully confirmed, as no survivors were ever found. Until now, it seems." Lyra felt the room tilt slightly around her, the weight of this new information settling over her like a physical force. "You're saying I might be descended from this pack? From the Duskwood bloodline?" "It would explain a great deal," Silas said carefully. "The strength of the mate bond, your mother's insistence on secrecy, on constant movement. If she was among the survivors of whatever happened to Duskwood, hiding you from a world that believed her entire bloodline extinct would have been a matter of survival, not simple caution." Cade turned Lyra gently to face him, his expression a complicated mixture of concern and something that looked almost like awe. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked quietly. "If this is true, if you truly are the last of the Duskwood bloodline, it changes everything. Politically, historically, for this pack, and for others across the entire region." "I don't understand any of it," Lyra admitted, her voice unsteady. "I don't know what the Duskwood pack was, what happened to them, or why any of this matters beyond explaining why my mother never let us stay anywhere long enough to be found." "We'll find out," Cade said firmly. "Together, as I promised. But Lyra, I need you to understand something important. If this is confirmed, if you are truly the last surviving heir of a bloodline once thought entirely extinct, there will be those who see that not as a discovery to celebrate, but as a threat to be eliminated." The words settled over her with cold, creeping dread, and Lyra understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever rumors Talia had already begun spreading about her connection to Ashwood were about to become the least of her concerns. Somewhere deep in her forgotten past, A truth far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined was waiting to be uncovered, and the closer she came to it, the more certain she became that not everyone within Blackthorn territory, or beyond it, would want that truth to stay hidden. News of the ritual's revelation spread through Blackthorn territory within hours, despite Cade's efforts to keep the information contained until the council could properly assess its implications. By the following morning, Lyra could feel the shift in how the pack regarded her. The wary suspicion of recent days, replaced by something closer to cautious fascination, though an undercurrent of unease remained, as if no one quite knew how to process the idea that a bloodline believed extinct for 30 years might have just walked back into existence. Corvin called an emergency council session before midday, and Lyra found herself once again standing before the assembled elders, though this time the atmosphere felt entirely different from her first appearance in that chamber. Where suspicion and hostility had dominated before, now there was something closer to careful reassessment. Elders studying her with expressions that suggested they were recalculating everything they thought they understood about the situation. If this revelation proves accurate, Corvin said, addressing the chamber, it changes the nature of our deliberations considerably. The Duskwood bloodline was not merely another pack among many. Their territory bordered our own for generations before the tragedy that ended their line. Their alliance, and later their loss, shaped the political landscape of this entire region in ways still felt today. What exactly happened to them? Lyra asked, unable to hold back the question any longer. Everyone keeps referencing this tragedy, but no one has actually explained what occurred. Silas, seated near the edge of the council's semicircle, answered carefully. The full truth was never definitively established. What is known is that the Duskwood pack was attacked during a single devastating night. Their lodge burned, their leadership killed, their remaining members scattered or presumed dead. The attack was blamed, at the time, on rising tensions with a rival pack, though the specifics were murky even then, and grew murkier still as the years passed. Which rival pack? Cade asked, his voice tight, with an intensity that suggested he already suspected the answer. Silas met his gaze steadily. Ashwood. The chamber fell into a heavy, charged silence. Lyra felt the pieces beginning to click together in her mind, forming a picture far more complicated and dangerous than she had initially understood. If Ashwood had been responsible for the destruction of her mother's entire bloodline 30 years ago, and if Talia's rumors linking Lyra to Ashwood were beginning to spread through the pack regardless of their falseness, then someone, somewhere, stood to benefit enormously from confusion about where her true loyalties lay. This cannot be coincidence, Cade said grimly. The timing of these rumors, immediately following the ritual's revelation. Someone is attempting to conflate Lyra's true bloodline with the very pack responsible for its destruction. You believe this is deliberate sabotage, Corvin said slowly, rather than simple misunderstanding born of fear. I believe, Cade said, his voice hardening, that whoever is spreading these rumors understands precisely what they're doing, and precisely how much damage they could cause if left unchecked. Lyra thought immediately of Talia, of the cold, calculating expression she had worn during their brief interactions over the past 2 weeks, but she said nothing, uncertain whether voicing the accusation aloud without proof would help, or simply deepen the divisions already forming within the pack. The council session continued for another hour, elders debating the political and historical implications of Lyra's potential lineage, questions raised about what her survival might mean for existing territorial agreements, old alliances that had shifted or dissolved in the 30 years since Duskwood's destruction, and whether her presence might reopen old wounds better left buried. By the time the session concluded, Lyra felt utterly drained, the weight of an entire hidden history settling onto her shoulders in a matter of hours. Cade found her afterward, sitting alone on the steps outside the council chamber, staring out at the darkening forest without really seeing it. You've had a difficult day, he said gently, sitting beside her. I've had a difficult 2 weeks, Lyra corrected, managing a tired, humorless laugh. I came here thinking I'd watch one ceremony and disappear again, the way I always have. Instead, I've learned I might be the last survivor of a bloodline destroyed by war, that someone is deliberately trying to paint me as a spy, and that my mother spent her entire life protecting a secret so dangerous it might still be putting me at risk today. I know it feels overwhelming, Cade said, but you're not facing any of it alone. Not anymore. Lyra turned to look at him, studying his face in the fading evening light. Why does that matter so much to you? I understand the bond, or at least I'm beginning to understand it. But this feels like more than that. You've put your own pack's stability at risk for me, over and over, since the moment I fell out of that tree. Cade considered the question carefully before answering. Because from the moment I caught your scent, something in me recognized you as mine to protect, in a way that has nothing to do with tradition or ceremony or political convenience. It's instinct, yes, but it's also simply true. I would do everything I've done, regardless of what your lineage turned out to be. The sincerity in his voice settled something anxious and uncertain in Lyra's chest, and for a moment, sitting beside him in the quiet evening air, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear or confusion, something warmer, steadier, that felt disturbingly close to hope. But that fragile peace shattered less than an hour later, when a young pack member came sprinting toward the lodge, breathless and pale, shouting for the Alpha King, before he had even fully crossed the clearing. "Alpha!" the young wolf gasped, skidding to a stop before them. "There's been an incident at the northern border." Ashwood scouts crossed the line. "One of our patrol members is injured, and—" he hesitated, glancing nervously at Lyra before continuing. "They found something at the scene. A scrap of fabric. Elder Corvin believes it may belong to the outsider woman." Lyra's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. I haven't left the lodge grounds in days." But even as she spoke the words, she saw the flicker of doubt crossing the young wolf's face, saw Cade's jaw tighten with barely restrained fury, and understood, with sickening clarity, that someone had planted evidence deliberately designed to implicate her in exactly the kind of betrayal the pack most feared. The 30 days she had been granted suddenly felt like they were shrinking by the hour, and somewhere within Blackthorn's own territory, an enemy far more immediate and dangerous than any ancient legend was working, patiently and ruthlessly, to make certain that whatever trust Lyra had begun building here would collapse entirely before she ever had the chance to prove it wrong. Cade was on his feet instantly, his expression transformed into something hard and dangerous that Lyra had not seen from him before. "Show me," he said to the young pack member, and then, turning to Lyra, his voice softened only slightly. "Stay close to me. I don't want you out of my sight until we understand exactly what happened tonight." They reached the northern border within the hour, torches carried by a dozen pack members casting flickering light across a scene of barely contained chaos. A patrol leader named Finn, blood staining his shoulder from a shallow wound, stood explaining the incident to a cluster of anxious wolves, while Corvin examined a small scrap of pale fabric held carefully in his gloved hand. "We were patrolling the usual route," Finn explained, wincing as another wolf tended to his injury, when 3 Ashwood scouts crossed the boundary marker. "We engaged briefly, before they retreated back across the line. During the confrontation, I found this caught on the underbrush near where they'd been standing." Corvin held up the fabric for Cade and Lyra to see, and Lyra's stomach dropped as she recognized the pale color and delicate weave, similar to material used in the ceremonial robes worn during rituals, though not identical to anything she herself had ever worn. "This isn't mine," she said immediately. "I don't even own anything made from that kind of fabric. It bears a resemblance to garments worn by outsiders unfamiliar with pack customs," Corvin said carefully, his tone neither accusing nor entirely convinced. "Combined with the timing, so soon after news of your possible Duskwood lineage spread through the territory, and the existing rumors regarding a connection to Ashwood, this discovery raises understandable concern. Someone planted this," Cade said flatly, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled anger. "Deliberately, and recently enough that it hasn't even had time to fully weather in the underbrush." Corvin examined the fabric more closely, and after a long moment, nodded slowly. "You may be correct. The edges show minimal wear, suggesting it was placed here, rather than caught accidentally during a genuine altercation." "Who would do something like this?" Finn asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "And why?" Lyra already suspected the answer, and judging by the tight, furious set of Cade's jaw, so did he, though neither of them voiced the name aloud in front of the gathered pack members. Accusing Talia without concrete proof would only deepen the very divisions someone was clearly trying to create, and Lyra understood, with growing unease, that whoever was behind this scheme had planned carefully enough to leave no obvious trail connecting them to the deception. "We need proof," Cade said quietly, once they had stepped away from the gathered patrol members. Real proof, not suspicion. Before we make any accusations. If we're wrong, it could tear this pack apart even further than these rumors already have. And if we're right? Lyra asked. Then whoever is responsible will answer for it, Cade said, his voice hard with certainty. But we need to be careful, and we need to be patient, however difficult that may be. Over the following days, Lyra found herself watching everyone around her with a wariness she hated but couldn't quite shake, uncertain who among the pack she could genuinely trust, and who might be quietly working against her. Mira remained a steady, reassuring presence, and Cade's devotion never wavered, but the whispers continued, growing louder despite Corvin's efforts to trace their true origin, and Lyra could feel the fragile progress she had made over the past 2 weeks, beginning to erode under the weight of suspicion that refused to fully dissipate. It was Mira, ultimately, who uncovered the first genuine thread of evidence, nearly a week after the border incident. She found Lyra in the small garden behind the healing lodge, her expression tight with barely contained urgency. "I need to show you something," Mira said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I overheard something earlier, near the eastern storage lodges. I don't think I was meant to hear it." "What did you hear?" Lyra asked, her pulse quickening. "Talia, speaking with someone I didn't recognize, someone who wasn't wearing Blackthorn colors. I couldn't make out everything, but I heard your name, and I heard the word Ashwood mentioned more than once. It didn't sound like casual conversation, Lyra. It sounded like they were coordinating something." Lyra felt a cold, sinking certainty settle over her. "We need to tell Cade." They found him in his study, and Mira repeated what she had overheard, her voice steady despite the obvious nervousness of accusing a fellow pack member of something so serious, without complete certainty. Cade listened intently, his expression darkening with every word. "This isn't proof," he said once Mira finished, "but it's enough to warrant closer observation. I want you to tell no one else what you heard, Mira. If Talia suspects we're watching her, she'll simply become more careful." Mira nodded, and after she left, Cade turned to Lyra, his expression heavy with something that looked almost like guilt. "I should have suspected this sooner," he said. "Talia has always been ambitious, but I never imagined she would go so far as to coordinate with Ashwood, of all packs, simply to reclaim a position she lost through no true fault of your own." "You couldn't have known," Lyra said gently, though the revelation left her feeling shaken and unsteady. "None of us could have." But even as she spoke the reassurance, a deeper unease was settling into her chest, one that had nothing to do with Talia's scheming, and everything to do with the growing realization that the danger surrounding her was not limited to rumors and whispered suspicion. If Talia truly was coordinating with Ashwood, the very pack responsible for destroying Lyra's bloodline 30 years ago, then whatever plan was unfolding around her was almost certainly larger and more dangerous than a simple bid to reclaim a ceremonial position. Somewhere beyond Blackthorn's borders, old enemies were stirring, drawn by rumors of a bloodline they had believed permanently destroyed, and Lyra understood, with growing dread, that the 30 days she had been granted to prove herself were rapidly becoming the least of her concerns. What waited for her now was something far older, far more dangerous, and far more determined to make certain that the last surviving heir of Duskwood never lived long enough to reclaim what had once been taken from her family. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived not through careful investigation or council deliberation, but through violence. It happened on the 22nd night of the observation period, when a small group of intruders breached the eastern edge of Blackthorn territory, under cover of darkness. Lyra woke to the sound of alarm horns echoing across the grounds, sharp and urgent, and within moments Cade was in her doorway, fully alert, his expression grim. "Stay close to me," he said. "Now." They moved quickly through the lodge, joining a rapidly assembling group of warriors near the central courtyard, where Corvin was already directing patrol leaders with sharp, efficient commands. Finn arrived moments later, blood already staining a fresh wound along his forearm, his expression tight with urgency. "Eastern boundary," he reported. "At least 6 intruders, moving fast, heading directly toward the lodge grounds. They're not testing the border this time, Alpha. They're coming in." "Ashwood?" Cade asked sharply. "Unconfirmed, but the formation matches their patrol tactics. Cade's jaw tightened, and he turned to Lyra, his expression softening only slightly, despite the chaos around them. I need you to stay here, in the lodge, with Mira and the other non-combatants. I know you want to help, but this isn't... I understand, Lyra said quickly, cutting off the protest before it fully formed, though every instinct in her screamed against simply hiding, while danger closed in around the pack, that had, however uncertainly, begun to feel like something close to home. Cade nodded once, relief flickering briefly across his face, before he turned and disappeared into the organized chaos of warriors preparing to meet the incoming threat. Lyra found Mira in the healing lodge, already preparing supplies for potential injuries, her expression tense but focused. What's happening? Lyra asked, helping to organize bandages and herbal remedies, despite the tremor in her hands. Ashwood scouts, moving in force, Mira said grimly. This is more than a border test. This feels like the beginning of something larger. The sounds of conflict reached them soon after, distant shouts, the clash of bodies, the occasional howl cutting sharply through the night air. Lyra worked alongside Mira, preparing for wounded warriors, trying desperately to keep her mind occupied, rather than dwelling on the fear twisting tighter in her chest with every passing minute. It was nearly an hour before the fighting finally quieted, and another agonizing stretch of time before word reached the healing lodge that the intruders had been repelled, though not without cost. Wounded warriors began arriving shortly after, and Lyra and Mira worked without pause, tending injuries, offering what comfort they could, the healing lodge filling with the low murmur of pain and exhausted relief. Cade arrived last, a shallow gash across his shoulder that he waved off as unimportant despite Mira's insistence on examining it properly. His eyes found Lyra immediately across the crowded room, and something in his expression, some combination of exhaustion and fierce protectiveness, made her chest tighten with an emotion too complicated to name. You're hurt, she said, moving toward him immediately. It's nothing, he said, though he allowed Mira to clean and bandage the wound while he spoke. We repelled them before they reached the main lodge. 3 of our warriors were injured, none seriously. The intruders retreated once they realized they'd lost the element of surprise. Was it Ashwood? Lyra asked. Cade's expression darkened. Confirmed. Several of the warriors recognized markings on their weapons. This wasn't a random probe, Lyra. This was targeted, timed precisely for a night when our defenses might have been distracted by internal matters. The implications settled heavily between them, and Lyra felt sick with the understanding of exactly what he meant. You think Talia coordinated the timing? I think, Cade said grimly, that we no longer have the luxury of gathering careful, incontrovertible proof before acting. Whatever alliance has formed between Talia and Ashwood, it has already cost this pack blood tonight, and I will not wait for another attack to confirm what we already strongly suspect. The following morning, Cade called an emergency council session, and this time, when Talia was summoned to appear, her composed mask cracked visibly the moment she entered the chamber and saw the assembled evidence laid out before the elders. Mira's overheard conversation, the planted fabric from the border incident weeks earlier, and testimony from 2 warriors who had recognized her voice among those coordinating with the retreating Ashwood scouts during the previous night's attack. This is absurd, Talia said, though her voice lacked its usual unshakable confidence. I would never conspire against my own pack. Then explain, Corvin said, his voice cold and unforgiving, why 3 separate warriors independently identified your voice near the eastern boundary last night, coordinating retreat positions with wolves wearing Ashwood markings. Talia's composure finally shattered entirely, her carefully maintained mask giving way to something raw and desperate. I never meant for anyone to be hurt, she said, her voice trembling. I only wanted to reclaim what should have been mine. Ashwood promised support, promised to help discredit the outsider woman enough that the council would reject the bond entirely, restore the ritual, and allow it to proceed as originally planned. I never agreed to any attack. I never wanted violence. And yet violence occurred, Cade said, his voice dangerously quiet. Because you opened the door to an enemy pack, believing they would limit themselves to spreading rumors rather than exploiting the opportunity you handed them. Talia had no response to that, her expression collapsing into something that looked, finally, like genuine horror at the consequences of her own choices. The council's judgment, when it came, was swift and severe. Banishment from Blackthorn territory, effective immediately, with a formal warning issued to all neighboring packs regarding her confirmed collaboration with Ashwood. Talia left the chamber in silence, her 4 years of careful ambition ending not in triumph, but in disgrace entirely of her own making. As the council session concluded, and the chamber slowly emptied, Cade turned to Lyra, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and lingering concern. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Talia may be gone, but Ashwood remains, and their interest in your bloodline hasn't diminished, simply because their inside source has been removed." Lyra nodded, understanding the truth of his words even as a fragile sense of vindication settled over her. The suspicion and rumors that had plagued her for weeks finally, definitively disproven. "Then we prepare," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Cade studied her for a long moment, something warm and unmistakable flickering behind his eyes. "Together," he agreed. Outside, beyond the walls of the council chamber, the pack was already beginning to shift in its understanding of her, suspicion giving way, slowly but unmistakably, to something closer to acceptance. But far beyond Blackthorn's borders, within Ashwood's own territory, the loss of their inside informant had done little to diminish their interest in the woman who carried Duskwood's bloodline. If anything, the failed attack and Talia's subsequent exposure had only confirmed what Ashwood's leadership had long suspected, that Lyra's survival represented a threat to old, carefully buried secrets they had spent 30 years working to keep hidden. And somewhere within Ashwood's own council chambers, plans were already being redrawn, this time with far less subtlety and far more urgency than before. The days following Talia's banishment brought a strange, uneasy calm to Blackthorn territory. Suspicion toward Lyra faded almost entirely, replaced by a kind of cautious respect that felt, to her, more meaningful than she had expected. Pack members who had once whispered when she passed now offered small nods of acknowledgement, occasionally even brief conversations, and Lyra found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, beginning to feel something like belonging. But the peace was fragile, and everyone within the lodge seemed to understand it. Patrol numbers along the northern border doubled, warriors trained with renewed intensity. Cade spent long hours in strategy sessions with Corvin and the other elders, preparing for a confrontation with Ashwood that felt, with each passing day, less like a possibility and more like an inevitability. It was during one of these tense, uncertain evenings that Silas approached Lyra privately, his expression carrying the weight of information he had clearly been reluctant to share. "I've spent the past several weeks researching the Duskwood bloodline more thoroughly," he said, settling into a chair across from her in the quiet study, where she had taken to spending her evenings. "There are details about that night 30 years ago that I believe you deserve to know, particularly given recent events." Lyra set down the book she had been reading, giving him her full attention. "Tell me." Silas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "The official account has always been that Ashwood attacked Duskwood over a territorial dispute, a conflict that spiraled beyond control. But there were always inconsistencies in that story, details that never quite added up. I've since uncovered records, suggesting the true motivation was something else entirely." "What kind of records?" "Old correspondence, hidden within the archives of a neutral pack that mediated regional disputes at the time. According to these letters, Duskwood possessed something Ashwood desperately wanted. Not territory, but knowledge. Specifically, knowledge of an ancient bonding ritual, one believed capable of strengthening a pack's collective power, far beyond what natural bonds typically provide." Lyra felt a chill settle over her. "And you think that's what this is really about? Not old grudges, but some kind of ritual?" "I believe," Silas said carefully, "that Duskwood's leadership at the time refused to share this knowledge with Ashwood, viewing it as too dangerous to be wielded by a pack already displaying troubling ambition. I believe that refusal is what truly led to the attack that destroyed your bloodline, and if that's accurate, then Ashwood's renewed interest in you now isn't merely about eliminating a potential political rival. It's about recovering knowledge they've spent 30 years trying to obtain by any means necessary." "Do I have this knowledge?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that even possible?" "I don't know," Silas admitted. It's possible such knowledge was passed down through your bloodline in ways you're not even consciously aware of. It's also possible it was lost entirely when Duskwood fell, and Ashwood has been chasing a ghost for 30 years, unwilling to accept that whatever they seek may no longer exist. The implications settled heavily over Lyra, another layer of complexity added to an already overwhelming situation. She thought of the ritual with Silas weeks earlier, the fragmented images and sensations she had experienced, wondering now whether there might be more buried within her, memories or knowledge inherited through blood that she had never had reason to access before. She shared this conversation with Cade later that evening, watching his expression shift through concern, calculation, and finally, a kind of grim determination. "If Ashwood believes you carry this knowledge," he said, "they will not stop pursuing you, regardless of what obstacles stand in their way. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before they force the issue through violence again." Silas mentioned another ritual, Lyra said carefully. "A deeper version of what we did before, one that might access more than surface memories. He said it carries more risk, but it might reveal whether this knowledge truly exists within me." Cade's jaw tightened. What kind of risk? He wasn't entirely specific, just that it requires going deeper into inherited memory than the first ritual, and that it can be disorienting, potentially dangerous if not handled carefully. "I don't like it," Cade said honestly, "but if it helps us understand what we're truly facing, and helps protect this pack from further attacks, I understand why it might be necessary." They brought the idea to Silas and Corvin the following morning, and after careful deliberation, the council agreed to proceed, with extensive precautions in place to monitor Lyra's well-being throughout the process. The ritual was scheduled for 3 days later, giving Silas time to properly prepare, and giving Lyra time to steel herself for whatever revelations, or dangers, waited within her own inherited memory. Those 3 days passed in a haze of nervous anticipation, Lyra spending much of her time with Cade, both of them trying, without much success, to distract themselves from the uncertainty ahead. On the final evening before the ritual, they walked together through the quiet forest surrounding the lodge, the autumn air carrying the first hints of coming winter. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Lyra said, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them, "I need you to know how grateful I am. For everything. For believing me when almost no one else did. For standing beside me through all of this, even when it put your own position at risk." Cade stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression open and unguarded, in a way she had rarely seen from him. "You don't need to thank me for that," he said quietly. "From the moment I caught your scent, protecting you stopped being a choice I was making. It became simply who I am now, as certain and unshakable as anything I've ever known." Lyra felt something warm and overwhelming settle in her chest, the accumulated weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty easing, just slightly, in the face of his quiet, unwavering certainty. "I think I understand now," she said softly, "what everyone meant, about the bond being undeniable. I feel it too. I have for a while now, if I'm honest with myself." Cade reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch careful and deliberate. "Then, whatever tomorrow reveals," he said, "we'll face it exactly the way we've faced everything else. Together." The following morning arrived with a heavy gray sky, fitting, Lyra thought, for the uncertainty of what waited ahead. The ritual chamber had been prepared with additional precautions this time, extra herbs meant to ease the process, several healers positioned nearby in case anything went wrong. Cade remained close throughout, his presence a steady anchor as Silas began the careful preparations. "This will go deeper than before," Silas warned gently. "You may experience memories that feel entirely your own, even though they belong to ancestors long past. Try to remain calm, and remember that whatever you experience, it cannot truly harm you here in this chamber." Lyra nodded, steadying her breathing, and the ritual began. This time, the falling sensation was immediate and overwhelming, pulling her far deeper than the fragmented glimpses of her first experience. She found herself standing, impossibly, within a memory that felt entirely real. A great hall lit by torchlight, wolves gathered in solemn ceremony, and at the center, a woman who looked strikingly similar to Lyra herself, speaking words in an ancient language that somehow, within the memory, made perfect sense. The knowledge poured into her all at once, overwhelming and disorienting. An ancient ritual capable of forging bonds not just between individual mates, but between entire packs, strengthening collective power in ways that could reshape the balance of an entire region. She understood, within the memory, why her ancestors had refused to share this knowledge, why they had recognized the catastrophic potential for abuse in the wrong hands, and why that refusal had ultimately cost them everything. And then, sharper and more painful than anything before it, she saw the attack itself, flames consuming the ancient hall, warriors falling, and her ancestor, the woman who so resembled her, making a desperate choice in the chaos, pressing something into the hands of a young child, before pushing her out into the darkness. Whispering words that echoed strangely familiar, words Lyra realized, with dawning horror, she had heard before, spoken by her own mother in the quiet moments, before sleep throughout her entire childhood. Run, hide, survive. Whatever it costs, survive. The ritual released her abruptly, and Lyra gasped back into awareness, tears streaming down her face before she even fully understood why. Cade's arms immediately wrapping around her, steady and grounding amid the overwhelming flood of inherited memory and emotion. I saw it, she managed, her voice shaking. The attack. My ancestor, protecting a child, pushing her to safety. I think that child was my grandmother, or perhaps further back than that. The knowledge Silas spoke of, it's real. I carry it, buried somewhere within me, exactly as Ashwood feared. Cade held her close, his expression fierce with protective determination. Then we prepare, he said quietly, for whatever comes next, knowing exactly what we're truly protecting, and exactly why Ashwood will stop at nothing to take it from you. Outside the ritual chamber, beyond the walls of Blackthorn territory, in a fortified lodge many miles to the north, Ashwood's Alpha stood before his own council, having just received confirmation, through sources still loyal within Blackthorn's ranks, despite Talia's banishment, that the ritual Duskwood's last heir had undergone, confirmed everything they had long suspected. The girl carried the knowledge. 30 years of searching, 30 years of careful, patient scheming, had finally led them to exactly what they had been seeking all along. It was time, the Ashwood Alpha decided, to stop waiting for subtlety to yield results, and instead take, by force if necessary, what diplomacy and deception had failed to secure. The attack came 7 days later, at the edge of dawn, when Blackthorn's defenses were at their most vulnerable and least expected. Lyra woke to the sound of horns blaring across the territory, far louder and more urgent than the alarm that had sounded weeks earlier during Ashwood's initial probe. This time, there was no ambiguity in the sound. This was not a border test. This was a full assault. Cade was already moving before she fully registered what was happening, pulling on armor with practiced efficiency, his expression hard and focused in a way that sent a fresh wave of fear through her chest. They've breached the northern boundary in force, he said grimly, confirming her worst fears. More warriors than we anticipated. This isn't a raid, Lyra. This is an invasion. What do you need me to do? She asked, refusing to simply hide away, while the pack that had become her home faced what sounded like its greatest threat in decades. Stay with Silas, Cade said firmly. He'll take you somewhere secure, away from the main fighting. Ashwood wants you specifically, Lyra. If they capture you, everything we're fighting to protect becomes meaningless. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on helping in whatever way she could, but the fierce urgency in his expression left no room for debate. He kissed her once, quick and desperate, a promise and a plea combined into a single gesture, before disappearing into the chaos gathering outside. Silas arrived moments later, his own expression tight with barely controlled fear. We need to move, he said. There's a hidden chamber beneath the healing lodge, reinforced for exactly this kind of emergency. It should keep you safe until the fighting concludes. They moved quickly through increasingly chaotic corridors, the sounds of battle growing louder even from within the lodge's thick walls, warriors rushing past in organized urgency, the acrid smell of smoke beginning to drift through the air from somewhere near the northern edge of the territory. Silas guided her down a narrow stone staircase hidden behind a false wall in the healing lodge's back room, into a small reinforced chamber lit by a single flickering torch. Stay here, he instructed. I need to help coordinate the healers upstairs. I'll return as soon as it's safe. Lyra nodded, though every instinct screamed against remaining hidden while chaos unfolded above her. The minutes stretched agonizingly, the muffled sounds of fighting filtering down through the stone floor, each distant crash or shout sending fresh waves of fear through her chest, as she thought of Cade, of Mira, of Finn and the other warriors who had become, over the past weeks, something close to family. She had no way of knowing how much time passed before the chamber's hidden entrance suddenly swung open again, revealing not Silas's familiar weathered face, but three unfamiliar warriors bearing markings she immediately recognized from descriptions of Ashwood's forces. Fear seized her chest, cold and absolute, as the largest of the three stepped forward, his expression calculating rather than hostile, which somehow felt more frightening than open aggression would have. "You must be the Duskwood heir," he said, his voice carrying an unsettling calm. "You'll come with us quietly, and no harm will come to your pack's warriors. Resist, and I cannot promise the same restraint." Lyra's mind raced, searching desperately for options, for any possible path to escape or resistance, and found none within the small confines of the reinforced chamber. The warriors closed in, and she felt rough hands seize her arms, pulling her forward despite her struggling, panic rising in her throat, as she was dragged back up the narrow staircase and out into the chaos of the battle still raging above. The scene that greeted her was devastating. Warriors locked in fierce combat throughout the lodge grounds, smoke rising from at least two structures near the northern boundary, the metallic scent of blood thick in the air. Her captors moved quickly, dragging her toward the eastern edge of the territory, clearly intending to slip away with their prize, while the majority of Blackthorn's forces remained occupied elsewhere. She caught a glimpse of Cade in the distance, locked in combat with two Ashwood warriors simultaneously, his movements fierce and precise despite being outnumbered, and she opened her mouth to call out to him, only for one of her captors to clamp a rough hand over her lips, silencing her before the sound could carry. But it was too late. Cade's head turned, some instinct alerting him, even without hearing her voice, and his eyes found her being dragged away, his expression transforming instantly from fierce concentration into something far more dangerous. He fought free of his opponents with brutal efficiency, closing the distance between them faster than Lyra would have thought possible, and her captors, seeing the Alpha King bearing down on them with unmistakable fury, made the split-second decision to abandon careful strategy in favor of immediate escape. They ran, dragging Lyra roughly along with them, but Cade was faster, relentless, cutting through the chaos of the battlefield with singular focus. He caught the largest of the three warriors, just as they reached the boundary line, and the fight that followed was brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided, Cade's fury lending him a speed and strength that overwhelmed his opponent within moments. The other two captors, seeing their leader defeated, released Lyra and fled back across the border, rather than face the same fate, disappearing into the tree line, as reinforcements from Blackthorn finally began arriving in force. Cade turned to Lyra immediately, his hands checking her over with frantic urgency despite the blood and exhaustion clearly weighing on him. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice shook with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "You found me. How did you know?" "I would always know," he said fiercely, pulling her into his arms despite the chaos still surrounding them. "No matter where they took you, no matter how far, I would have found you." Around them, the battle was finally turning decisively in Blackthorn's favor, Ashwood's remaining forces retreating in disarray, now that their primary objective had failed and their numbers had thinned considerably under the counterattack. Within another hour, the fighting had ceased entirely, Ashwood's warriors withdrawing back across the border, leaving Blackthorn territory scarred, but ultimately victorious. The cost, however, was significant. Several warriors had been seriously injured, two structures near the northern boundary had burned, and the pack's sense of security, so carefully rebuilt over the past weeks, had been shaken once again by the reality of just how far Ashwood was willing to go to reclaim what they believed rightfully theirs. As the pack began the difficult work of tending wounds and assessing damage, Lyra stood amid the wreckage, Cade's arms still wrapped protectively around her shoulders, and understood, with cold clarity, that this attack would not be the last. Ashwood had failed to capture her today, but their determination had not wavered, and their next attempt, she suspected, would come with far greater force and far less hesitation. "This needs to end," she said quietly, staring out at the scarred northern boundary. Permanently. I won't watch this pack bleed again, because of knowledge buried in my blood that I never asked to carry. Cade turned to look at her, something fierce and determined settling into his expression. Then we end it, he said. Together, and on our terms, not theirs. Somewhere beyond the smoke-hazed horizon, within Ashwood's own territory, their alpha received word of the failed extraction, with barely contained fury, already calculating his next move, understanding that subtlety and patience had run their course. What remained now was a far more direct and dangerous confrontation, one that would determine, once and for all, whether the last heir of Duskwood would finally be captured, or whether Blackthorn's Alpha King would prove strong enough to protect what he had claimed as irrevocably his own. In the days that followed the attack, Blackthorn territory transformed into something resembling a fortress under siege, every available warrior mobilized, every boundary reinforced, the entire pack operating with the grim understanding that Ashwood's next move would likely be decisive rather than probing. Lyra spent those days working alongside Mira in the healing lodge, tending to the wounded from the previous battle, trying to channel her fear and frustration into something productive rather than allowing it to consume her entirely. But beneath the surface of her focused efforts, a different kind of determination was slowly taking shape, one she had not yet shared with Cade, uncertain how he would react to the plan forming in her mind. She found Silas alone in the archive room late one evening, still poring over old records related to Duskwood and the ancient bonding ritual at the heart of Ashwood's obsession. "I need to understand this ritual completely," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him. "Not fragments, not glimpses through inherited memory. I need to know exactly what it does, and exactly what it would take to either use it or destroy the knowledge of it permanently." Silas studied her carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because Ashwood isn't going to stop," Lyra said. "Not while they believe this knowledge exists and remains within reach. If I could either use this ritual to strengthen Blackthorn's position so thoroughly that Ashwood no longer poses a credible threat, or find a way to destroy the knowledge entirely, removing their motivation altogether, either outcome ends this conflict far more permanently than simply defending against endless attacks." Silas was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of what she was suggesting. The ritual, if performed correctly, would require not just your participation, but the full cooperation of the pack's alpha, and likely significant preparation and risk. It has not been successfully performed in generations, and the old records suggest the process itself carries genuine danger, both for the participants and potentially for the broader region if the resulting power is not carefully managed. "But it's possible," Lyra pressed. "Possible, yes. Advisable, I honestly cannot say." They discussed the details late into the night, Silas sharing everything the old records revealed about the ritual's requirements, its history, and the reasons Duskwood's leadership had ultimately refused to share the knowledge with anyone, including their own allies, recognizing the immense responsibility and danger inherent in wielding such power. When Lyra finally brought the idea to Cade the following morning, his reaction was immediate and firm. "Absolutely not," he said. "The risk is too significant, both to you and to the pack. We will find another way to end this conflict." "There is no other way," Lyra argued, frustration rising in her voice. "Ashwood will keep attacking, keep pushing, keep costing this pack lives, for as long as they believe capturing me might grant them access to this knowledge. The only ways to truly end this are to eliminate their belief that the knowledge exists, or to use it ourselves in a way that makes further conflict pointless. And if the ritual fails, if it costs you your life, or unleashes something we cannot control, then at least I'll have tried to end this the right way," Lyra said, her voice softening slightly. "Cade, I can't keep watching your warriors bleed for me. I can't keep hiding while this pack pays the price for a bloodline I didn't even know I carried until a few weeks ago. I need to do something." Cade studied her for a long moment, the fierce protectiveness in his expression warring visibly with genuine respect for her determination. "If we do this," he said finally, "we do it together, with every precaution Silas can provide, and with the full support of the council, rather than acting alone." Lyra nodded, relief flooding through her at his reluctant agreement. "Together," she echoed. The council, once informed of the plan, debated fiercely for 2 full days before ultimately granting cautious approval, understanding, as Cade and Lyra did, that the alternative, continued conflict with no clear resolution in sight, offered little hope of a better outcome. Silas began intensive preparations immediately, gathering rare herbs, consulting ancient texts, and establishing every safeguard he could devise to minimize the risks involved. The ritual was scheduled for the night of the next full moon, chosen deliberately for the heightened power such nights traditionally carried within pack tradition. As the day approached, Lyra found herself spending increasing amounts of time with Cade, both of them aware, though neither spoke it aloud, that the outcome of the coming ritual remained genuinely uncertain. On the evening before the ritual, they walked together to the same clearing where everything had begun weeks earlier, the sacred grove where Lyra had first hidden in the trees, where Cade had first caught her scent and abandoned an entire ceremony because of it. "It feels strange being back here," Lyra said, studying the familiar clearing, now empty and quiet, under the gathering dusk. "So much has changed since that night." "Everything has changed," Cade agreed, taking her hand gently. "I was a king bound by tradition and expectation, preparing to choose a mate through ceremony rather than genuine connection. And then you fell out of a tree, quite literally, and upended everything I thought I understood about my own life." Lyra laughed softly, despite the tension underlying their conversation, grateful for the small moment of levity. "I'm still sorry about that, disrupting your entire ceremony." "Don't be," Cade said, turning to face her fully, his expression serious now. "That disruption led me to you, and whatever risks tomorrow holds, I would not trade the past several weeks for anything, regardless of how they began." They stood together in the quiet clearing as the last light of day faded into darkness, and Lyra felt, despite the uncertainty of what waited ahead, a profound sense of gratitude for everything that had unfolded since that first fateful night, for the bond that had upended both their lives, for the truth about her heritage finally coming to light, and for the man standing beside her, who had chosen her, again and again, despite every obstacle and danger that choice had brought upon them both. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "I want you to know that finding you, finding this place, finding the truth about who I truly am, has been worth every difficult moment that led me here." Cade pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Tomorrow, we finish this," he said, "together, exactly as we faced everything else." Above them, the moon continued its slow climb toward fullness, indifferent to the enormous stakes gathering beneath its silver light, patient and steady, as it had been through centuries of pack history, wars, alliances, and now, finally, the culmination of a conflict 30 years in the making, waiting to be resolved once and for all, beneath its watchful glow. The night of the full moon arrived with a clarity and stillness that felt almost sacred, the sky cloudless, the air crisp with the first true bite of approaching winter. The entire pack gathered in the sacred grove, forming a wide circle around the central clearing, where a great fire had been prepared, its flames already climbing high into the darkening sky by the time Lyra and Cade arrived, dressed in ceremonial robes that Silas had prepared specifically for the ritual ahead. Corvin stood near the fire alongside Silas, both elders' expressions grave with the weight of what was about to unfold. Beyond them, the assembled pack watched in tense silence, warriors still bearing bandages from the recent battle, standing shoulder to shoulder with healers and elders, every member of Blackthorn territory understanding that tonight's outcome would shape their future, in ways both immediate and permanent. "Are you certain about this?" Cade asked quietly, as they approached the fire together, his hand steady around hers despite the visible tension in his expression. "I am," Lyra said, and found, to her own surprise, that she truly meant it. Whatever fear remained beneath the surface, it was outweighed entirely by her determination to finally end the cycle of violence and fear that had shadowed her entire life, long before she had ever understood its true source. Silas began the ritual with careful, measured movements, spreading rare herbs around the fire's perimeter, murmuring words in the same ancient language Lyra had heard echoing through her inherited memories weeks earlier. The air around them seemed to shift and thicken, charged with an energy that raised the hair on Lyra's arms even before the ritual's true power began to build. "The bond between you," Silas explained to the gathered pack, his voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing, "already exists, confirmed and undeniable. Tonight, we ask that bond to extend beyond the two of you, weaving through the entire pack, strengthening not just a single connection, but the collective strength and unity of everyone gathered here. Lyra felt Cade's hand tighten around hers as the ritual's intensity began building, the fire's flames responding to Silas's words, climbing higher, their color shifting subtly from ordinary orange gold to something with a deeper, more resonant quality that seemed to hum with barely contained power. The knowledge she had glimpsed during her earlier ritual with Silas rose to the surface of her awareness now, no longer fragmented or distant, but clear and immediate, guiding her through movements and words that felt both entirely foreign and, somehow, deeply familiar, as though her body remembered what her conscious mind had never been taught. She reached out, taking Cade's other hand, completing the circle between them, and spoke the words that rose unbidden from somewhere deep within her inherited memory, ancient and powerful, carrying the weight of everything her ancestors had once understood and had died to protect from those who would misuse it. The power that answered her words was immediate and overwhelming, a surge of energy that swept through the clearing like a physical force, the assembled pack gasping collectively as the sensation washed over them, something warm and binding settling into place, connecting every wolf present in a way that felt, to Lyra, both ancient and entirely new. Cade's eyes met hers across the firelight, and she saw reflected there the same overwhelming sensation she herself was experiencing, not just the confirmation of their own bond, already strong and unshakable, but something larger now, a connection extending outward to encompass the entire pack, weaving them together into something more resilient, more unified than they had ever been before. The ritual concluded as suddenly as it had begun, the fire's flames settling back into their ordinary color, the charged energy in the air gradually dissipating, leaving behind a profound, almost reverent silence across the clearing. "It's done," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and awe. "The bond has been forged, exactly as the old text described, though I confess I never truly believed I would witness it accomplished within my lifetime." Corvin stepped forward, his expression, for the first time since Lyra had met him, entirely free of suspicion or reservation. "Whatever knowledge Ashwood once sought to steal," he said, "it now exists, not as something to be captured or stolen, but as something already given freely, woven permanently into the fabric of this entire pack. There is nothing left for them to take." The truth of his words settled over the clearing, and Lyra felt, for the first time since discovering her true heritage, a profound sense of relief and completion. The knowledge that had cost her ancestors everything, that had shadowed her entire life without her even understanding why, had finally found its purpose, not as a weapon to be seized by those seeking power, but as a gift freely given to a pack that had chosen to protect her, exactly as her mother had once tried desperately to do. Cade pulled her close amid the celebrating pack, warriors and healers and elders alike breaking into spontaneous, relieved celebration around them, the tension of recent weeks finally beginning to ease into something resembling genuine hope. "You did it," he said softly, his forehead resting against hers. "You ended 30 years of fear and conflict tonight." "We did it," Lyra corrected gently, "together, exactly as we promised." Word of the successful ritual, and the resulting strengthened bond throughout Blackthorn's entire pack, reached Ashwood's territory within days, carried by scouts who witnessed firsthand the transformed energy and unity, now radiating from their rival pack's borders. Whatever knowledge Ashwood had spent 30 years pursuing, it was now beyond their reach entirely, freely given, and permanently woven into a pack far too strong, and far too unified, to be threatened by further aggression. Faced with the reality of a pack now bound by ancient power they could never hope to seize through force, Ashwood's Alpha made the pragmatic, if bitter, decision to formally withdraw all claims and hostilities, recognizing that continued conflict offered nothing but further losses against an enemy that had transformed overnight from a vulnerable target into something far more formidable. The formal peace treaty was signed 3 weeks later, in a carefully neutral location, overseen by representatives from several surrounding packs, finally bringing to a close a conflict that had begun 30 years earlier with the destruction of Duskwood, and had nearly claimed Blackthorn as its next casualty. Lyra stood beside Cade as the treaty was formally signed, watching the culmination of everything she had endured since that first fateful night hiding in the sacred grove's ancient oak, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, something she had never truly experienced before: the profound, unshakable certainty of finally, completely, belonging exactly where she was meant to be. 6 months later, the sacred grove looked entirely different from the tense, chaotic clearing Lyra remembered from her first desperate night hiding among its branches. Autumn had given way fully to winter, and now, with spring beginning to soften the edges of the forest, the same grove had been transformed for an occasion the entire pack had eagerly anticipated for weeks. Flowers lined the clearing, carefully arranged by pack members who had spent days preparing for the ceremony, and soft lanterns replaced the great bonfire of previous rituals, casting a gentler, more intimate glow across the gathered crowd. Every member of Blackthorn territory had turned out for the occasion, along with representatives from several neighboring packs, including, notably, a small delegation from Ashwood, extending formal goodwill 6 months into their fragile but genuine new peace. Lyra stood at the edge of the clearing, dressed in a flowing gown, far removed from the simple, practical clothing she had worn during her first desperate weeks within pack territory, Mira fussing with the final details of her appearance with the same warm, genuine affection she had shown from their very first meeting. "Nervous?" Mira asked, adjusting a final flower woven into Lyra's hair. "Terrified," Lyra admitted, laughing softly, despite the honest tremor in her voice. "Though I suppose that's fitting, given how everything between Cade and me began." "I'd say this is a considerable improvement over hiding in a tree," Mira said with a grin, and Lyra laughed again, more freely this time, grateful beyond words for the friendship that had sustained her through the most difficult months of her entire life. The ceremony began as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the same golden light that had first illuminated Cade's face on the night everything had changed, now bathing the clearing in a warm, welcoming glow. Corvin, once her staunchest skeptic, now stood ready to formally preside over the ceremony, his expression carrying none of the suspicion that had once colored every interaction between them, replaced instead by genuine warmth and respect. Lyra walked toward the center of the clearing, where Cade waited, dressed in formal attire that somehow still failed to diminish the commanding presence that had first caught her attention months earlier. His expression, as she approached, held none of the guarded composure he had once worn as Alpha King, replaced entirely by open, unguarded joy that made her own heart swell with matching happiness. "You look beautiful," he murmured as she reached him, taking her hands gently in his. "You look like you might actually be more nervous than I am," she teased softly, and he laughed, some of the visible tension easing from his shoulders. Corvin began the formal ceremony, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, speaking words that echoed, deliberately, some of the same ancient language used during the ritual that had ended their conflict with Ashwood months earlier, though this time, the words carried none of the desperate urgency that had defined that previous night, only celebration and genuine joy. "6 months ago," Corvin said, addressing the gathered crowd, "this pack faced its greatest crisis in 30 years, brought about, inadvertently, by the arrival of a woman none of us expected, carrying a history none of us fully understood. Tonight, we celebrate not just the union of our Alpha King with his true mate, but the extraordinary courage and strength this woman has shown throughout every challenge that history brought upon her, and upon all of us." Lyra felt tears gathering in her eyes as Corvin continued, the elder's words carrying genuine warmth and respect that would have seemed impossible during their first tense meeting in the council chamber months earlier. She glanced around the clearing, taking in the faces of everyone who had become, over these difficult but transformative months, something she had never truly experienced before in her entire wandering, isolated life. A genuine, unshakable community she belonged to completely. Cade squeezed her hands gently, drawing her attention back to him, and she saw in his expression everything she needed to know about the life stretching ahead of them both, uncertain in its specific details but absolutely certain in its foundation. "I promise you," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, despite the gathered crowd surrounding them, "that whatever challenges the future brings, we will face them exactly as we've faced everything since that first night in this very clearing. Together, without hesitation, and without fear." Together, Lyra echoed, the same promise they had made to each other so many times throughout the past difficult months, now transformed into something permanent, something that would carry them forward through whatever the coming years held. As Corvin pronounced the ceremony complete, The gathered crowd erupted into celebration. Warriors and healers and elders alike, breaking into joyful cheers that echoed through the ancient trees surrounding the clearing. Somewhere among the celebrating crowd, Mira wiped happy tears from her eyes, while Finn and Silas exchanged warm, satisfied smiles, having both played crucial roles in the journey that had led to this moment. Lyra looked out at the celebrating pack, at the ancient oak tree still standing at the clearing's edge where she had once hidden, terrified and uncertain, watching a ceremony she had never expected to become part of, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the strange, difficult, ultimately beautiful path that had led her here. She had come to this grove as an outsider, curious and alone, expecting nothing more than a single stolen glimpse into a world she believed would never truly welcome her. Instead, she had found not just a mate whose devotion had never wavered through every danger and difficulty they faced together, but an entire pack that had become, against every expectation, genuinely and completely her home. The sun finally dipped below the horizon as the celebration continued late into the evening, the same full moon that had witnessed the beginning of her extraordinary journey, now rising once again over the sacred grove, silver and steady, illuminating a future finally secure. A bloodline finally protected rather than hunted, and a love that had begun with nothing more than a single scent, carried on the evening wind, strong enough to stop an entire ceremony, and strong enough, ultimately, to heal 30 years of hidden pain and rebuild something far stronger in its place. Lyra Blackthorn, once an outsider with no pack and no history, stood now at the center of a community that had claimed her as fully and completely their own, her hand held securely in Cade's, her heart finally, entirely at peace. Whatever challenges still waited in the years ahead, she understood now, with absolute certainty, that she would never again face them alone.